This part of the presentation will look at concepts and models. Last week we heard Adam Anair present the first study conducted by Charles R. Graham, who was the chair of the Department of Instructional Psychology and Technology at Brigham Young University. Graham's first study, as presented by Adam Anair, outlined the institutional rationales for adopting blended learning, which are related to learning outcomes, learner satisfaction, faculty satisfaction, access and convenience, and cost efficiencies. And I think by now we're all pretty familiar with Rogers' diffusion of innovation. This second study into the institutional drivers and barriers to faculty adoption of blended learning applied the Graham framework and Rogers' DOI model. The Graham framework was developed to measure institutional adoption and implementation of blended learning based on interview data from 6 institutions at various stages of adoption and implementation. The key markers researchers identified were strategy, which includes issues regarding the overall design of blended learning. Example, definition and policies, forms of advocacy, degree of implementation, and purposes for implementation. Structure encompasses issues relating to the technological, pedagogical, and administrative framework facilitating the blended learning environment. Example, governance, blended learning models, scheduling, and evaluation. Support involves issues relating to the manner in which an institution facilitates faculty implementation and maintenance of its blended learning design. Example, technical support, pedagogical support, and faculty incentives. In relation to the DOI framework, Graham and team employed the research data and aspects of Rogers' innovation adoption phases to outline the following 3 stages of institutional adoption and implementation. Stage 1 is awareness and exploration. An institution has not yet adopted a strategy regarding blended learning, but administrators are aware of it and show limited support for individual faculty exploring ways in which they may employ blended learning techniques in their class. Stage 2 is adoption and early implementation. An institution adopts a blended learning strategy and experiments with new policies and practices to support its implementation. Stage 3 is mature implementation and growth. An institution has well-established blended learning strategies, structure, and support that are integral to its operation. The summary of the models, the Graham framework and the Rogers adoption phases investigated the following research questions. 1. What institutional strategies, structure, and support decisions facilitate or impede blended learning adoption among higher education faculty? 2. Does the innovation adoption status of higher education faculty members affect which institutional strategy, structure, and support decisions will facilitate or impede their blended learning adoption? Please pause the video and return to the classroom to discuss data collection. Don't forget to give us a check mark when you return. This part of the presentation will showcase the results from this study. Overall, more faculty indicated structure and support would significantly influence their adoption decisions. Example, over 53% of respondents indicated the availability of sufficient infrastructure to quickly upload and download media and materials on campus would significantly influence them. Over 32% of respondents noted the availability of technical support would influence them. And 28% indicated pedagogical support would be significantly influential. What's missing? While fewer faculty identified strategy decisions as influential, over 28% did note that their adoption decision would be significantly influenced by whether the institution's reason for promoting blended learning aligned with their own thinking. This slide will show the comparison between how faculty self-identified and compare it to the blended learning scores. Here are the results from the self-identification. And here are the results from their blended learning scores. As you can see from this chart, self-categorization differs dramatically from blended learning adoption scores, or as I refer to this chart as perception versus reality. Researchers ultimately chose to use the blended learning scores to place them into the Rogers categories. They did note that self-categorization is not a wasteful endeavor, as faculty who overestimate their innovativeness may be more willing to adjust their actions with their self-perception. For a full description on how respondents were scored and ultimately put into these categories, please see Table 2 in the appendix section of this presentation. We're now going to look at the influences by adopter categories. Overall, they concluded that the availability of sufficient infrastructure, technological support, pedagogical support, blended learning evaluation data, and the alignment of faculty and administrators' purpose for adopting blended learning would have the most significant influence on faculty's blended learning adoption decision. Here are the factors each category identified for adopted blending learning. Innovators and early adopters, they concluded that providing infrastructure and support, as well as identifying the institution's purpose for adopting blended learning, are the most influential for this group. Since this group identified evaluation data, they concluded institutions may consider collecting such data from the early adopters courses and sharing it with the early majority. For those recruiting the late majority, they may consider providing sufficient training and support for them within a secure infrastructure. As for the laggards, they reported infrastructure, technical support, and one-on-one training among the most influential, which aligns with Rogers' description of the later majority as feeling less comfortable with technology. Overall, these conclusions align with the descriptors Rogers identifies in DOI theory. A summary of the conclusions and recommendations. Institutions need to facilitate adoption among early adopters who could then become influential peers with the later adopters. Once these groups are successfully implementing blended learning, they may consider adjusting their implementation strategies to breach the adoption chasm between early adopters and the early majority, as the early majority typically adopt a new innovation when they have compelling evidence of its value. For example, the early majority was the only group to report evaluation data as having the second most significant influence on their adoption decision. Since laggards identified essentially the same decisions as influential, example, infrastructure, support, and purpose that innovators and early adopters did, institutions can prepare to meet the needs of laggards as they meet the needs of early adopters with additional one-on-one technical support. And lastly, institutions have to effectively communicate the purpose of adopting blended learning and illustrate the purpose aligns with the faculty's own principles on blended learning. You can now stop the video and return to the classroom for the final section on pros and cons. Don't forget to give us a check mark. Thank you.